Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm pretty much set to go. I've got my glove on. I've got some yummy foods to feed to the wormies. And the worms that are getting fed are the ones that live inside these yellow buckets here. They're ENCs, European nightcrawlers. They've been living in these buckets for 194 days and over that time have received 14 feedings. Today's feeding will be their 15th. So I'm going to get them up onto the bench over here and take care of getting them fed. It would seem that my buckets have guardians. I just looked into bucket number 3 and there's a similar guardian, but here in bucket number 1, I'm going to see about getting our little friend, the spider, I guess some of his web, also out of here. Put him back over onto the shelf, and once the bucket goes back onto the shelf, he can have back at it. Well, that was interesting. I figured as long as I'm relocating the spider out of this system, I'll go get the one that I saw in system number 3, and there really was actually 2 that needed to be moved out. One of them was pretty easy going about it, and the other one just did not want to be bothered. So I had to chase him all over. He went underneath the bucket. I had to tip the bucket over so I can try to get at him. Then he jumped off the bench. I finally got him up on the stick and I was able to haul him over to the shelf, reunite him with his friend. You can see the tail of a worm diving down a little bit into the material. This to me right here looks like the stem of a banana, which has been pretty heavily worked. The material all has a really nice dark color, and it's I think because of its moisture content, maybe because the lighting is a little bit difficult to get down here into the buckets. I just remember this system as seeming to be all bedding for the longest time, and then more recently, past few check-ins, we sort of had a little bit of an eye-opening revelation when we, came in here and found the whole system appeared to have just started to operate in high gear or something, and is really cooking now. So the oh yeah, before I get too far down the road and forget to mention it, the coffee filter that was resting here on this side of the bin was indicating to us where we had fed last, which was on this side of the system. So we've been alternating sides on each occasion, so that means the next feeding will be positioned on the other side. And that means we're going to open up a hole down here to apply today's feeding. And before we do that, though, let's take a quick look where the last feeding was placed 14 days ago. I didn't take the time to revisit the video from last time, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'd been holding out on these 3 packets of chestnuts, and at some point I really felt like I needed to finally do away with them and compost them. So they were, I believe they were what I used to feed these 3 systems last time. So there was 3 packets of chestnuts, stuff that had just been sitting in my pantry for so long that I just didn't really trust it. I think it even had a stamped expiration or use by date, and it was way overdue. But the worms don't care about expiration dates. They'll munch down on it gladly. And if what I am thinking was the last feeding, all those chestnuts, kind of not too much of a surprise that there's really no sign of them. The only thing I was spotting when I was pouring through here a little bit was the scraps of some paper, which I believe was the newspaper that had been part of the top coverings. When we opened this thing up, there was only one top covering piece of cardboard. So up until pretty recently, we actually had 2 pieces of paper, that cardboard plus a newspaper sheet. I believe a piece of newspaper folded in half, so it was more than just a single sheet of paper. But not long ago, we decided it was time to upgrade its purpose, include it down in a feeding as bedding, and let it get broken down finally after performing so nicely as top covering for us. And now we're left with only the cardboard top covering. Alright. This is pretty nice stuff. Whole system seems like it's very far along. If you consider its age, almost 200 days of age, it even seems a little bit unusual that it would have only been fed 14 times. My systems usually hit their 14th, 15th feeding at this point. Probably, I don't know, somewhere around day 150. So this thing's a good month and a half kind of overdue on reaching its 15th feeding. And that's just because we had settled on and kept to a 14-day feeding interval, which is a bit more than it needs to be, obviously. They completely did away with what was given last time, leaving no leftovers. And, you know, I've even been thinking at some point it might be a good idea, not because we're out of space in these systems, or because I'm desperate for the castings or anything like that, but I thought it might be time to start winding these bins down, let the worms finish off what still remains as far as leftovers within each of these buckets, and start thinking about how exactly these systems are going to get harvested. Because the question's been coming up a couple times, I believe, now in the comments pertaining to our check-ins on these systems. And I believe one thing seems obvious is that just working in these cramped quarters doesn't really provide any benefit. So I believe working on these systems to set up, I don't know, a migration, or just to somehow separate them from their material, whatever the case may be, however we decide, it would most easily be done in some sort of other container. I don't know. We'll see how it goes, but that's so far the seemingly obvious thing. So we'll have to figure that out when we get there, but for now it's still just chalking up as another feeding for the yellow buckets, European nightcrawlers in the yellow buckets. So now I think we kind of know what to expect here, and we don't have to spend a lot of time brainstorming and kicking ideas around or replaying the past. So at this point maybe we can kind of just be more mindful of a little bit of sort of comparison, this compared to that. You know, I mean, if we were to come in here and find a whole bunch of chestnuts, for example, we'd really have to question why does this one have virtually no signs of breakdown of their last meal? Is there a problem? That's not the case. I'm just, you know, using that as a possible thing that we could have bumped into when we came into here. But luckily things in here seem to be coming along more or less like we saw in the first bin. I would have to comment that maybe the material is not as damp, but there's really hardly a discernible difference. It's just because I came out of that other system and came into this system, and I guess just comparing them a little bit, it does feel like this is maybe a little bit more crumbly, a little bit more dry, but not dry to the point where the worms would be in hazard or in trouble, so you don't have to worry about that. And here too, it also seems like we had a good bit of residual leftover bedding bits. So that may be, you know, attestable to the fact that maybe a little bit more moisture would help those things break down a little bit more readily. I don't really want to go too crazy deviating from giving each system a very simple and consistent feeding and whatever else I give it. And obviously if things were super dry and dangerous, then they would definitely need to get squirted down here a little bit, but I'm not seeing enough of a difference here that I would want to deviate from giving them the same exact thing every other system's getting, which is going to be just a handful of veggies, a couple handfuls. Alright, that's probably about what they got in the first bin. We'll save the rest for the third bin. And hopefully the third bin is also coming along just as nice. I would say that all of these systems so far, both of these systems we've checked in on so far, are looking really good. These are cantaloupe melon rinds. A little bit tougher than, you know, paper, I think. So it breaks down a little bit slower than your typical bedding. It's just part of one of their recent feedings, and probably won't show signs of many leftovers next time we come back in here, which will probably be 2 weeks from now. And I'm still questioning whether I want to make that next check-in yet another feeding, or would it be nice to start thinking of this 15th feeding as being possibly the last one, and sending it down the road of just foraging, letting the worms pick off the last bits of leftovers throughout the system, perhaps even giving the systems that are a little bit more damp some time to dry off a little. And, well, let's see. Can it be that we're already at bucket number 3? Seems that way. So yeah, it was funny trying to evict the 2 spiders that were camped out in here. Definitely felt like the one of them was really just not having it. Somehow I got him to crawl up onto my stick and I moved him back over to the shelf, so it's all good. Okay. Much the same as far as I could tell so far, but we haven't gone too into it yet. But nice castings developing over on the side that was most recently fed. Some leftovers of what appears to be cantaloupe rind. Let's see if we spot any leftover bits of chestnut, which seems a little bit unlikely here. But we are finding some of the repurposed newspaper that had been top covering in here. Look at the thickness in the... This is a strong... Oh, I broke it in half now. Maybe I should have left it whole. It's just a leaf stem. Oopsie. But it's a really big one, thick one. And that one's probably just going to have to get caught in a screen or something at some point. I don't know. We'll have to figure out how I'm going to process this material. I did do one batch of worms, one system that I wanted to retire. And rather than light separating them or migrating them, I just ran the entire contents of the system through a sieve. And all the really, really fine material that I assumed was for the most part castings, but also a bunch of cocoons, maybe a bunch of baby worms, all went one way into sort of a nursery setup. And then what was left was stuff that still needed more work anyway to be broken down by the worms. All the large particle material leftovers, bits of bedding and food, plus a lot of the worms, most of the worms, with which I launched a couple systems. So I kind of liked it, the way that worked. Probably a little bit more, I don't know, jarring on the poor wormies by having to get screened. But it did seem like it was almost like a time-saving approach. So I might end up doing it that way here in these systems too, just sieving everything through and maybe hanging on to all the stuff that did get caught in the sieve as a possible source for a whole bunch of new babies after the cocoons in the material start to hatch. And then with whatever worms we collect, along with all the large chunk stuff that still needs more time, we could think about starting some new systems. Whether they'll be buckets again or not, I don't know. I like the way these buckets are working. They're certainly producing awesome results. But if the aim is to be able to share the work being done in my worm systems on these videos, then doing so in these buckets certainly isn't the most optimal, as I think most people know already. But I would treat that as pretty much the only drawback. Certainly no reason to not use buckets. If you're doing it yourself, they're super handy in terms of how they stack up on top of one another, and got that nice handle on there. They're super durable, good capacity, very easy to obtain, and almost free, really. So definitely an endorsement for using buckets. Oopsie. Looks like we caught a little hitchhiker a little bit late in the game, but the important thing is that we caught him before we went to the sink. It ended up flushing him down the drain. I'm always careful to look over my tools and my gear before I head to the sink, so I don't want to be flushing worms down the sink unnecessarily. I know it happens, but if I can avoid it, I'm going to try. Alright everyone, that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.